Hello, my name is Sophie von Laer, and I'm the inventor of a robotic arm that works with the eye signals and a nanocarbon electrode that can potentially cure Alzheimer's. I also have a PhD in organizational leadership and currently working as a leadership and executive coach for the Fortune 500 companies. Today, we are going to talk about some really interesting subjects about self-identity and what it means to discover who you really are, and how to present yourself, and many more interesting things. So stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Do you sometimes feel a bit constricted, like the way you are supposed to come at a challenge kind of shoves you in a box that blocks you from your own natural genius in ways that can make you less likely to take on risks, or maybe even make you play small? Well, stay tuned, because that's where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. So this episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how do we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart and your mind and your soul have been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and oftentimes pretty intense conversations with some of the world's most interesting people, including my guest today. But you'll have to find out more about that in a bit by going to Curiosity Bites and listening to a full, real deep dive into our conversation with our guest. But our guests include astronauts, neuroscientists, philosophers, holy people, quantum physicists, skeptics, entrepreneurs, Grammy award-winning entertainers, and some folks you might think you'd completely disagree with who are truly fascinating. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sign up for and sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. As always, you can find both of the shows on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. We need your help in staying relevant, though, so please do us a favor. Get over to wherever you tune in, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. If you are a regular listener, huge, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. You can also listen to us through Google Home or Alexa by simply saying, play Dov Baron podcast. Again, we really want to thank you for sharing this show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. In an attempt to define yourself as a leader, have you inadvertently attached to false labels that have restricted you and maybe even restricted what you're capable of? What if your background in an area seems to have no, at least on the surface of it, no relevance, but it's exactly what you need to embrace? What if you've over-organized your self-identity in an attempt to fit in, and you haven't realized that you've boxed away some of your greatest assets? Furthermore, what if unboxing yourself is the key to tapping into the neuroscience-based leadership development that you can really use to develop yourself and those you'll lead? Well, let's find out together, because our guest today is Sophie von Laer. Now, with a background in system engineering, neuroscience, and organizational leadership, Sophie she has a totally multidisciplinary approach. She's an engineer and a consultant. At age 21, she had invented a robotic arm that works with eye signals, EOG, for the US military. She also created a nanocarbon brain electrode that has the potential to cure Alzheimer's disease. In addition to her 3 engineering degrees, she is currently working on an organizational leadership PhD. And as part of her PhD, her work with organizational leadership, she has more than a decade of experience coaching and consulting with nonprofits, for-profits, and Fortune 500 companies like General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Freddie Mac, Lockheed Martin. She has a current focus on neuroscience-based leadership development. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome the multifaceted wisdom of Sophie von Laer. Welcome.
Oh my God! Thank you, Bob. You're a fresh up breather, and just your energy is contagious. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Soph. It's good to have you here. I'm really glad for us to have this conversation. And as I said, for those of you who want to know more, we've got a whole big in-depth conversation that went on Curiosity Bites, where we really go into all kinds of wonderful facets of who you are, including the history of who you are and where you came from. That is a fascinating background for those people who want to know more. But let's start where we always like to start this show, which is, who is somebody who's influenced you in this world of where everybody's claiming to be an influencer? I'm often surprised at who has influenced my guests, who are often people that we wouldn't normally think of. They might be somebody we've never even heard of. Who's somebody for you?
I would say my aunt.
Your aunt. Oh, okay.
My aunt. She like myself is an immigrant to this country, and she passed away last year. So that's why I'm using past tense, but her spirit and her journey and story remains. But she's the most influential. The reason for that is that she at any point wanted to learn a language. She knew 7 languages. And she got her doctorate degree at the age of 53.
Beautiful.
And then she became a full-on medicine doctor at the age of 64.
Wow.
Yeah. So she got practice, as a doctor for, I think 4 years before she passed away. But she had this very experimental, daredevil relationship with life, and her as a leader was a very interesting character and multifaceted and ever learning. That's the best way to put it.
So I was going to say, so if you had to put that into a single point of how she influenced you, was it that point that you just said there of always be committed to learning, growing, and up leveling yourself? And because she was definitely not stuck in one zone.
Yes, exactly. So it was interesting because she was one of those people that was constantly seeking meaning behind her suffering. She had 3 unsuccessful marriages, and not normal marriages. One turned out to be a serial killer, one was a drug addict. So she wasn't great at picking men, let's just say. But
wow, she is an interesting character. I'm sorry she's dead. I want to meet her.
Oh yeah, she was an interesting character. But she, despite of all that, she always had this very interesting way of finding meaning and carrying like her burden in a way that it doesn't become other people's, but rather becomes a source of encouragement and source of hope. So she was very good at not only communicating different languages, but communicating hope.
Wow. She sounds like a fascinating lady. What an amazing person to have had in your life who, could have that level of influence on you. That is really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. It's very cool. Would you mind sharing her name just so that we have even her first name, just so we have a reference point?
I used to call her Khale Kata. Khale in Farsi means aunt, and Kata was a short for her name, Katayun.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, and it's interesting because, you talked about her being this multifaceted individual who was committed to learning. And of course, you're a very multifaceted individual. We've talked a lot about that on Curiosity Bites. But, one of the things that, you and I got to in that conversation, and I want to bring here, I think it's so vitally important. In the context of leadership development, what's the question we should be looking for answers to that we're just not, that people are just not paying attention to? Because you've got all these variety of backgrounds that you've brought into your leadership work. So in the context of leadership development, what's the question that we should be looking for answers to that we're not?
I think we talk a lot about communication, and we talk a lot about, collaboration and connection, but we don't talk about leaders as this lonely, at times isolated individuals that feel confused and lost.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't talk about the individual herself. And that to me is a very interesting phenomenon and duality, that we don't focus on the person, the inner child that feeling sometimes intimidated or afraid or unsure.
Well, it's interesting because we know that 74% of all executives are suffering from imposter syndrome.
Yes.
And many of those people are at the top of their game. And we've talked about that many times on this show. However, I think you're absolutely right. We don't we speak about being a better leader to others, but we don't confront to ourselves. So what is it in that we need to go after, in asking ourselves the questions that we're not asking?
I think embracing dualities. There is a lot of talk of being perfect and doing this, as you mentioned. The concept of, even the literature goes as far as developing followers. The idea of followership. The leadership literature goes after leadership as a phenomenon of influence, but it doesn't go on pointing back the arrow to the person and says, how do you talk about self-leadership? How do you manage your own emotion? How do you manage your own fears and who you are? So I think focusing on that, coming on with better techniques that, just including personal development as a part of leadership development, outside of the usual realm of core values and all these things, that it's, once again, it's outward focused.
Yes.
I think it would go really, so I guess embracing dualities, embracing, layers to the person, and going deep, not being afraid.
Yeah, the layers and the depth is definitely gets missed. That's why I love the work that I do. But in that, let's go to one of your layers, because you're talking about this embracing duality, taking a look at within oneself at a deeper level, and on the surface of it, you've got 3 degrees in engineering. It couldn't seem more dualistic, right? Because you're talking about this deep, quote, woo-woo stuff versus the nuts and bolts mechanics of things that is about engineering, that engineering is about. So talk to us about bringing that together for yourself, so that maybe our listener, our leaders, our viewers have a sense of that they can take that part of themselves that's hidden away and bring it forward.
Great question. And this is a question that I've been asked many times. And the only thing I can say is that the common denominator between everything I've done has been the love for humanity and love for discovery. And I think that love translates into understanding people so well, in a way that, just being that multidimensional, seeing different parts of people, not just their analytical minds, the engineering side, the way they, think about a problem and come up with the solution, and being strategic and all the great things that, I guess, on the management side of things, right? If you translate it, but also leadership side of it. If you look at the brain and look at the physiology of the person, and in organizational leadership, look at the psychologies, the psychometers that actually impact a leader's development. I think we have a tendency in the society to create really interesting lines between different subjects. And in words of the book Generalist, the only people that actually thrive are the ones that refuse to really draw any lines and see humans as holistic as they are. And I think just my way of approach to life has been very, I see you as you are because I see myself as this very abstract character that I am.
You know, that is very interesting to me. I've spoken lots about this, and I think it's a vitally important challenge. Is that in this niche world that we live in, where we're constantly bombarded with being in a niche, yet the most interesting, the most wise people I know don't live in a niche. They don't live in a niche at all. They are, as you said, they are multifaceted. They have depth, and they live in the blurred lines between not one or two things, but often between 7 and 8 things. I know that I do. And I know that that's often very difficult for people to grasp because they want to say, well, are you this? No. Are you that? No. Are you that then? No. I'm all of that and a bunch more. So walk us through that, how you're working with the leaders you're working with in having them embrace that, Sophie, because that can be pretty scary for them because there's so much identity in, I'm a XYZ leader versus I'm all that and a whole bunch more. Walk us, have our listeners, our viewers get a sense of how they might step into that a little bit.
Going back to the words you used as far as unboxing, I really like that idea of once you label who you are and what you are and create a sense of, self-identity, then it's very hard to stay in this state of limbo almost and continue to add different facets to who you are. Mm-hmm. So I guess if you're in a state of like, compliance and just a status quo and okay with who you are, one of the things that is not used for this purpose that I actually use, actually two things, is that I actually apply change management techniques that usually are applied on organizational level to individual level interventions. For instance, the first step to Cotter of change management approach is to create a sense of urgency, right? So it is very important, which states that you need to kind of like come up with the data and the trend analysis of who you are, what you are, and then it goes into setting the vision and then creating a coalition. And there is this like, many steps of 8 steps that you follow. So I use that model as a way. So I guess this first step is sense of urgency. Why who you are is not working, or in other more mainstream way, what got you here won't get you there. So it's a mentality of staying adaptive and flexible and providing information on why that's urgent to be looked at.
Okay, so so this is the thing, and we see this organizationally, we see this individually. I know I do, which is I had a conversation with a friend of mine last week, and I said, he's just written a great new book, and I said, this is a fabulous book for the people who won't read it. And he said, yeah, that's true, because the people who need what it is we're talking about are not likely to use it. The people who have some level of flexibility, who are a little bit more open to these kinds of things, will embrace it. So when you're working with one of these leaders at this highest level, and you're talking about change management at the first level, and you go, okay, so the first level of that is to create the urgency, understanding that you need to change. It's not working, right, dude? Right. Okay. But now you want me to change? And I always say, people love change as long as it's got nothing to do with them. Everybody wants change as long as they don't have to. So walk us through getting that person to understand that urgency for themselves. They can understand it externally, but internally it's a very different thing because it's identity. It's egoic. It feels almost cellular for most people.
Oh, of course. And I absolutely agree with you. And it's one of those things that change is like everything else is a muscle. So the more you endorse change, the more adaptable you become. It's a concept of developing self-efficacy instead of self-confidence. So the more you do, the more you can do, the more you work out, the more you can work out. So the same applies to change. The leaders that actually are willing to change, they don't need for me to tell them to change, right?
No,
They
exactly.
just always look for the next hit. But the ones that don't are the ones that you have to create, sense of urgency for. So to answer your question as far as how you actually change the status quo or disturb the, homeostasis, if you may, in my other planet of disturbing something's homeostasis,
Yeah.
that has to come with creating safety. You have to, yes. So psychological safety is the first step. You never want to change someone's psyche if they're in the midst of chaos. So you always attack some of the tactical challenges they have and allow them to have some time to go through this process of self-discovery and self-change and come to realization of a different, more agile version of themselves. So I think that's the first step of creating safety. So whether that means creating an understanding of the political environment that they're in, which usually is the problem, whether that means mapping out all the stakeholders and finding out how to make them happy, anything it takes for them to feel a sense of, safety and control, and they're not, drifting. And then you can start creating that characteristics that allows them to have self-efficacy and therefore embrace change.
So self-efficacy. Talk to us a little bit about what that means to you, because I don't want to go into anything that appears to be a jargon for anybody who's going, well, I don't know what that means for me. So walk us through a little bit of that so that people can really grasp that.
My understanding of it is that for you to, for instance, the mothers that are very overly protective of their children, right, and they don't allow them to experience life and just put them in a bubble, then later the child questions his or her ability to encounter life and whether they are capable of overcoming chaos and adverse effects of the chaos gets to them too much. They internalize it too much as a result of that. Whereas people that have become a little bit of good swimmers, they are not too afraid of muddy water and some thunderstorms. So it's a matter of upbringing. But then as an adult, you can expose yourself. I mean, this is the very cliche concept of putting yourself out of your comfort zone, right? Exposing yourself to things that are a little bit risky, but being able to come, out of it. Okay.
But then we're back to the same thing, Sophie, which is this, resilience comes from taking risks and learning to build that muscle, as you said. But to take the risk, you have to take the risk, right? To get the resilience, you have to take the risk. To take the risk, I have to, and it's very interesting to me because one of the things in my work is I say to people, please understand that courage is subjective. What's very easy for me may be very difficult for you. What may be very difficult for me may be very easy for you. And I think that part of this that I love about the work that you do is that you're having people assess that themselves, right? And having them and say, okay, what would be a risk for you? What's the step you need to take in order for you to feel like you're just a little out of your comfort zone enough to feel better. Is that right?
Oh yeah. And I love how you put it, so it's a chicken and egg dilemma, right? It's there is a precursor to every event. But
yes,
another way to look at it, Dov, is to look at it through the Meserow's disorienting dilemma concept, right?
Okay. Tell us about that.
It's just kind of like a learning model in some ways of how some disorienting, something that happens to you that completely ruined your sense of reality for temporary amount of time.
Yes.
And how you interpret it and internalize it, how you create meaning out of it, the process of meaning making, right? that actually leads to that muscle in some way. So maybe it's not about seeking risks necessarily always. It's maybe interpreting the chaos, interpreting what's outside as a way that actually turns into some sort of meaning. So,
Yes.
so maybe for your listeners, it would be great to find their disorienting dilemma and look into that concept and see if they can attach more meaning than they think to those moments of their lives and internalize it better.
But the fact of the matter is that everybody, when they had that event, did give it meaning. It may not be an empowering meaning, but they gave it some meaning.
Right.
Because that's the nature of human beings. We give everything meaning. We are meaning-making machines, but
Right.
we often give a disempowering meaning to a situation. So are you suggesting that they go back and look at this disorienting moment in time and potentially re-examine the meaning they've given it and look for a new meaning that might be more empowering?
Yes. And see how that trend has developed. So maybe the concept that Meserow introduces is transformative learning.
Right.
So basically the idea of what has transformed you and who you have become, and whether you're okay with who you are now as a result of it. And if not, you're not a tree, move.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we're already coming towards the end of this first part of our two-part show here with Sophie. And I want to make sure that you know more about her. So before we finish part one, we're going to come back with part two, just a quick click away for you, dear listener. But Sophie, please tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and all the things that you do, all your resources, and then we'll come back for part two.
Oh, of course, Dov. So Sophie von Laer, I am very active on LinkedIn. I love networking, and right now I do a lot of coaching and consulting with individuals and organizations to help them, define who they are and combat some of the adversities they go through. Yeah, if they want to find me, I'm sure that you're gonna link some of my information.
LinkedIn,
But
yep.
yeah.
And your website?
So it's nafscoach.com. NAFS coach.com.
Okay, fabulous. All right, dear listener, stay with us for part two of this delicious interview with Sophie von Laer. We'll be back with her in just a moment. Remember, we're just one click away to part two of this fabulous interview. We'll see you then. Till then, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious.